A police officer decides to catch a black courier, suspecting him of a crime. But when he discovers who this courier really is, his world turns upside down. Will he accept the truth or continue living in his delusions? Subscribe so you don't miss the climax of this story. And what do you think? Can deeply rooted prejudices be changed? Share your opinion in the comments. Officer John Mason stared through his patrol car's windshield, watching the black man on a bicycle deliver a package to a house in one of the city's affluent neighborhoods. There was nothing particularly unusual about the man's appearance. He wore a plain uniform typical of couriers, with a small, well-worn backpack slung over his shoulder. But for Mason, the sight of a black man regularly entering and exiting these predominantly white, upscale neighborhoods was enough to spark suspicion. John Mason was not your average police officer. Raised in a conservative household, where distrust of outsiders was a family mantra, he had grown up believing in clear lines between us and them. His parents had made sure of that. Now, as an adult and a veteran officer on the force, Mason saw it as his duty to keep his city safe from what he perceived as threats, especially those he imagined came from people who looked like the courier he was now watching. The notion of a black man moving freely in these neighborhoods, seemingly comfortable and familiar with his surroundings, rubbed Mason the wrong way. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched as he observed the courier finish his delivery and mount his bike again. The man moved with a purpose, exuding a calm confidence that only further irked Mason. He had seen this courier several times over the past few weeks, always cycling through different parts of the city, from wealthier districts to the less well-off neighborhoods. In Mason's mind, no one should have this kind of range, especially not someone like him. Mason's partner, Officer Jenkins, glanced at him from the passenger seat. "What's got you all worked up, John? You've been eyeing that guy for weeks now." Mason didn't respond immediately. Instead, he narrowed his eyes, watching as the courier rode down the street, seemingly oblivious to the officer's intense scrutiny. "You ever wonder what a guy like that is up to? Riding around like he owns the place," Mason finally muttered. Jenkins sighed. "He's a courier, John. Probably just delivering packages, doing his job. Besides, I haven't heard any complaints from anyone in these parts about him." But Mason wasn't convinced. That's because people don't know what to look for. They don't see what's really going on. Deciding he'd had enough of merely observing, Mason switched on his patrol car's engine and began to tail the courier down the street. Jenkins, used to Mason's bouts of paranoia, silently stared out of his window, knowing better than to argue with his partner when he was in one of his moods. After a few blocks, Mason saw his opportunity. The courier had slowed down, preparing to make a turn. Mason hit the siren for a brief moment, and then flicked on his lights, pulling up alongside the man and signaling for him to stop. The courier, surprised but composed, slowed his bike to a stop and removed his helmet. He was a tall, fit man in his late 50s, with short-cropped gray hair and a face lined with experience but softened by a calm demeanor. He didn't appear fazed by the sudden stop. Instead, he waited, hands relaxed on his handlebars, as Mason stepped out of the patrol car, exuding an air of authority. "Afternoon, officer," the man said politely. "Something wrong?" Mason looked him up and down, not bothering to hide his suspicion. "Got some ID on you, pal? Need to see some identification." The man nodded, reaching slowly into his pocket to produce his wallet. "Sure thing. My name's Samuel Harris, but folks usually call me Sam." Mason took the ID and scrutinized it. "Samuel Harris, huh? Mind telling me what you're doing around here, Sam?" "Just making my rounds, officer. Delivering packages to some of the folks in the neighborhood," Sam replied evenly. Mason's eyes darted back to Sam's ID, then to his face, searching for something, anything that might give him a reason to dig deeper. But there was nothing there, except calm confidence. "What kind of packages?" Mason pressed. "What's in them?" "Mostly groceries, medication, sometimes books," Sam answered, unfazed. "I run a small delivery service for veterans and elderly folks who can't get out as much. Helps them stay independent." Mason's eyes narrowed. "For veterans, huh? You don't say." Sam smiled slightly. "Yes, sir. I'm a veteran myself. Retired general. Army." Mason's suspicion only deepened. He handed back Sam's ID, but continued his questioning. "You got any proof of that? Anyone can say they're a vet." Sam nodded. "I can give you my service number if you want to check with the VA officer. But I promise you, I'm not out here causing trouble. Just trying to do some good." Mason wasn't satisfied. He could feel his pulse quickening, a familiar rush of adrenaline that surged whenever he felt he was closing in on something. He glanced back at Jenkins, who was watching the exchange quietly. "Why don't you pop open that bag and let's see what you've got in there," Mason said, trying to mask his growing frustration under a veneer of protocol. Sam, still calm, dismounted his bike and carefully opened his backpack, revealing its contents. A few sealed containers of homemade meals, some medicine bottles, and a couple of books. Everything was neatly organized. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Jenkins leaned over from the car. "Looks pretty straightforward, John. Maybe we should let him be." But Mason wasn't ready to let go. "I'll be the judge of that," he snapped. He sifted through the contents, inspecting each item as if expecting something illegal to leap out at him. But there was nothing. Sam stood patiently, his face neutral but his eyes sharp, observing the officer's every move. After what felt like an eternity, Mason stepped back, his frustration evident. "All right, you can go," he said curtly, though his tone suggested he wasn't finished. Sam nodded, packed his things back into his bag, and mounted his bike again. "Thanks, officer. You have a good day now." Mason watched as Sam rode off, his mind racing. Something about this man didn't sit right with him, and he wasn't about to let it go. "I'm telling you, there's more to this guy than meets the eye," he muttered to Jenkins as he climbed back into the patrol car. Jenkins sighed again. "Maybe, John. Or maybe he's just a good guy doing good things." Mason didn't reply. He wasn't sure yet what his next move would be, but he knew one thing. He wasn't done with Samuel Harris. Over the next few days, Mason kept tabs on Sam's movements, noting each neighborhood he visited and every delivery he made. He documented his observations meticulously, convinced he was onto something bigger. In his mind, there had to be a hidden agenda, some criminal activity masked by a facade of charity. The more Mason followed Sam, the more he noticed how well respected the man was in every neighborhood. People greeted him warmly, thanked him profusely, and even invited him inside for a moment's rest. It didn't make sense to Mason. How could this man, a complete stranger, garner such trust and respect? Determined to find answers, Mason decided he would confront Sam again, this time with a stronger hand. He needed to prove to everyone, his superiors, his colleagues, and himself, that his suspicions were justified. The next time he saw Sam making a delivery, he'd make sure it wasn't just a simple stop and search. He'd make an arrest, if need be. And with that, Mason's plan took shape. He would catch Samuel Harris red-handed, and there'd be no escaping the truth this time. Over the next few weeks, Officer John Mason's obsession with Sam Harris grew. To him, Sam's calm demeanor and the respect he commanded in the neighborhoods he frequented were all the more reason to dig deeper. Mason was convinced that this so-called retired general was hiding something. He could feel it in his gut, and his gut rarely let him down, or so he believed. From his patrol car, Mason would watch as Sam moved from street to street, from neighborhood to neighborhood. Sometimes he would trail him from a distance, noting down each stop and every interaction. He'd see Sam deliver a package to a small apartment complex in a poorer district, then cycle to a high-end gated community and leave groceries at the doorstep of an elderly resident. To Mason, this sort of range was unusual. Most couriers had a fixed area or route, but Sam seemed to go wherever he pleased. Mason's partner, Officer Jenkins, had grown increasingly uneasy about his colleague's behavior. "John, you've been following this guy around for weeks now. If he was up to something, don't you think we'd have seen it by now?" Mason didn't look away from his target. "You don't understand, Mike. Guys like him, they don't just roam around in these neighborhoods without a reason. He's too comfortable, too at ease. There's something off about that." Jenkins shook his head. "Maybe he's just doing his job, John. Ever think of that?" But Mason was already set in his ways. He had seen too many cases go cold because of a lack of vigilance, or so he thought. In his mind, Sam's consistent calmness was not a sign of innocence, but a cover for something more sinister. To him, Sam's friendliness with the residents was a facade, a calculated move to blend in and hide whatever illegal activity he was involved in. Mason decided that his next step would be to increase the pressure. Over the next few days, he began stopping Sam more frequently. Each time, he'd fabricate a new reason for the stop. Sometimes it was a routine check for contraband. Other times, it was a concern about a potential traffic violation. He'd question him about his route, his deliveries, even his personal life. Each encounter was met with the same steady calm from Sam. He would hand over his identification, answer the questions politely, and then go on his way. He never argued, never raised his voice. This only served to frustrate Mason further. He wanted to see the man crack, to reveal the cracks in his seemingly perfect facade. One afternoon, after stopping Sam for the third time in a week, Mason leaned in close, his voice dripping with menace. "You think you're clever, don't you? Riding around like you own the place, thinking nobody's going to figure you out." Sam looked at him steadily, his eyes unwavering. "Officer, I'm just trying to do my job and help some folks who need it. If there's something specific you're looking for, I'd be happy to cooperate." Mason clenched his teeth. "Don't get smart with me, Harris. You can pretend all you want, but I know there's more going on here than just delivering groceries." Sam held his gaze but didn't respond. He knew better than to antagonize a man like Mason, especially when he could feel the tension mounting. Instead, he remained quiet, his silence only adding to Mason's mounting frustration. Back at the precinct, Mason's behavior was becoming a topic of concern. Several of his colleagues had begun to notice his fixation on the Courier. They knew Mason had a tendency to latch onto cases, but this was different. The way he spoke about Sam was tinged with an undercurrent of something more, a kind of personal vendetta. One afternoon, Sergeant Peterson called Mason into his office. "John, close the door," Peterson said, his tone serious. Mason obeyed, feeling the tension in the room. "I've been hearing things, John, about you spending a lot of time tailing this one guy, this Courier, Harris. What's going on?" Mason squared his shoulders. "Just doing my job, Sarge. I'm following up on a suspicious individual. Guys all over the city, in and out of neighborhoods, acting like he's got nothing to hide. Something's off about him." Peterson sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Look, I trust your instincts, John, but you've got to be careful here. If there's nothing concrete, we're wasting resources, and you're wasting time. We can't afford to make mistakes, especially in these times. You know how it is." Mason nodded, but inside, he was seething. He didn't need to be told how to do his job. He'd been on the force long enough to know when something was off, and he wasn't about to let this go. Not yet. While Mason's obsession grew, Sam continued his work undeterred. He knew the type of man Mason was. He'd encountered plenty of his kind during his time in the military and in civilian life. Men like Mason operated on fear and control, always seeing threats where there were none. Despite the harassment, Sam kept his routine, making sure the elderly veterans and the disabled he served received their deliveries on time. The more Mason tried to intimidate him, the more the community rallied around Sam. Residents would leave him encouraging notes, thank him personally when he came by, and some even started to notice Mason's patrol car lingering around. One day, as Sam was making a delivery to Mrs. Reynolds, an elderly widow whose husband had served in World War II, she caught sight of Mason parked down the street. "That man again," she muttered, her eyes narrowing. "You've got yourself quite the admirer, Sam." Sam chuckled softly. "It seems that way, Mrs. Reynolds. But don't worry about me. I've dealt with worse." She shook her head. "Well, you just keep doing what you're doing, dear. We all know you're one of the good ones." Her words meant more to Sam than she could ever know. He had spent his life fighting for what was right, and he wasn't about to let one bad cop make him back down now. For Mason, every kind word directed at Sam was another slap in the face. The more he saw people welcoming Sam, the deeper his anger grew. He couldn't understand how this man, who to him was so clearly suspicious, could fool everyone around him. It felt like a personal insult, an affront to his authority and his belief in his ability to read people. Driven by his frustration, Mason began taking things further. He started questioning people in the neighborhoods where Sam delivered, asking them if they'd noticed anything unusual, any strange behavior. Most of them brushed him off, some even criticizing him for harassing a good man. But Mason was relentless. "You'll see," he would mutter to himself, after each failed attempt to gather dirt on Sam. "You'll all see what I see." Then came the day that changed everything. It was a sweltering afternoon, and Mason had been tailing Sam for hours. He watched as Sam made his rounds, dropping off packages and exchanging warm words with the residents. Everything seemed routine until Sam entered a high-end gated community with a large, unmarked package strapped to his bike. This was it, Mason thought. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. He could feel his pulse quickening as he called in to dispatch, requesting backup. "I'm going in," he said to Jenkins, who was sitting next to him, looking more uncomfortable by the minute. "John, maybe we should—" "Stay here and back me up, Mike. I'm taking this guy down today." Mason's decision was made as Sam approached the front door of a house to deliver the package. Mason revved the engine and pulled up, lights flashing. He jumped out of the patrol car, his hand already on his gun. Hands in the air. Now, Sam froze, clearly surprised but still composed. He slowly raised his hands, his eyes locking with Mason's. "Officer, what's this about?" "You know damn well what this is about," Mason barked. "Get down on the ground, now." Residents started to gather, murmuring among themselves, their phones out, recording the unfolding scene. Sam carefully set down the package and lowered himself to the ground, not wanting to escalate things further. He had seen enough men like Mason in his life to know how this could end if he wasn't careful. As Mason moved closer, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" "That's General Harris." Mason turned, stunned, as the crowd began to grow more agitated. The tension was thick in the air, and Mason's grip on his gun tightened. This wasn't going to end the way he had planned. The heat of the afternoon sun bore down heavily on the scene unfolding in the gated community. Tension hung in the air like a thick fog as Officer John Mason kept his gun trained on Sam Harris, who lay face down on the hot pavement. The murmurs from the crowd of onlookers grew louder, filled with confusion, concern, and outrage. More phones were out now, recording every second of the encounter. Sam, his cheek pressed against the scorching asphalt, could hear Mason's heavy breathing. He knew that men like Mason often acted on impulse, driven by fear and prejudice. The wrong move, the wrong word, could turn this tense situation deadly. He remained still, his hands visible, his voice calm. "Officer Mason, there's no need for this. I'm just making a delivery." Mason, sweating profusely, ignored him. His mind was racing, his adrenaline pumping. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, but he was too deep in his own narrative to back down now. He'd convinced himself that he was finally going to expose this fraud. The moment had come to show everyone what he'd known all along. "Shut up," Mason barked, his voice cracking with a mix of authority and fear. "You think you can play me, huh? What's in the package? Drugs? Weapons? Who are you working for?" Sam took a slow breath, keeping his voice level. "Officer, I've told you before, I'm delivering groceries and medication to an elderly veteran and his wife who live here. If you'll just check my bag." "Enough," Mason shouted, cutting him off. "I'm done with your games, Harris. We're doing this my way now." He moved closer, his weapon still drawn, ready to make an arrest. The residents of the gated community watched in shock. Many of them knew Sam. He had been delivering to their homes for months, sometimes even longer. They knew him as a kind, dependable man who went out of his way to help others, not the criminal Mason was trying to paint him as. Several of them began to shout out in protest. "What's going on here?" one elderly woman exclaimed. "This man is no criminal. He's helped me more times than I can count." Another voice cut through the crowd, more forceful, more authoritative. "Hey, you there! Officer, stop what you're doing. That man is General Samuel Harris." Mason's eyes flicked toward the voice. An older man, well-built but clearly aged by time, was stepping forward. He wore a bowl cap emblazoned with a military insignia, and his stance commanded attention. "I served under that man. He's a damn war hero." For a split second, Mason faltered. His gaze shifted from the man in the crowd back to Sam, who was still lying motionless on the ground. The grip on his gun tightened, and his heart pounded even harder. "Back off," he shouted, feeling his authority slipping away. "Everyone, back off." The scene was rapidly spiraling out of control. The crowd, emboldened by the veteran's declaration, began to close in, growing more vocal with their outrage. Cries of "Let him go!" and "This is harassment!" rang out. Several people had already dialed 911, calling for additional police support, while others continued to film. Mason's partner, Officer Jenkins, was still in the patrol car, looking increasingly worried. He knew this was going too far, but he also knew that Mason wasn't the kind to back down when he felt challenged. Jenkins stepped out of the car and cautiously approached. "John," he said in a low voice, trying to keep calm, "maybe we should listen to what they're saying. If this guy's really who they say he is." "Stay out of this, Mike," Mason snapped back, his voice trembling with rage. "I've got this under control." But it was becoming painfully clear that control was slipping away. The crowd was pressing closer, and the tension was building to a breaking point. Suddenly, an elderly woman stepped forward, her face set in a fierce determination. "Officer Mason," she said loudly, "you need to stop this right now. General Harris has been helping my husband, who's bedridden. The man is a saint." Mason, his face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment, looked around at the crowd. Every eye was on him. Every phone pointed his way. He knew if he backed down now, he'd lose all credibility, his career, his authority. Everything would be questioned. With a grunt, Mason holstered his gun and reached for his handcuffs. "All right, Harris. Get up slowly, hands behind your back. You're under arrest for suspicion of..." Before he could finish, the veteran who had spoken up earlier stepped forward, placing himself between Mason and Sam. "You're making a big mistake, son. he said, his voice firm but steady. This man saved lives, mine included. He doesn't deserve this. Mason's face contorted with frustration. "Get out of my way," he growled, trying to push past the veteran. But the man held his ground. "Not until you back off and let this man go." The crowd erupted in a mix of applause and cries of support. Mason felt his control slipping away entirely. His breathing became ragged, and for a moment he considered shoving the veteran aside. But he caught Jenkins' eye. His partner was shaking his head, his expression pleading. "John, don't do this," Jenkins said softly, almost a whisper lost amidst the noise of the crowd. "Think about what you're doing." Mason's hand hesitated on his belt. He was trapped between his stubbornness and the undeniable truth that was staring him in the face. He was wrong, and now everyone knew it. Just then, the sound of sirens filled the air, and 2 more patrol cars pulled up. Several officers stepped out, taking in the chaotic scene, the crowd, the phones, the tension. Sergeant Peterson was among them. He quickly assessed the situation, his face tightening as he realized the gravity of what was happening. "John," Peterson barked, "stand down. Right now." Mason, breathing heavily, finally took a step back, his face a mask of defiance and humiliation. Peterson moved forward, his tone brokering no argument. "Get those handcuffs off him now." Reluctantly, Mason complied, his movements stiff and jerky as he released Sam from his restraints. Sam, keeping his composure, slowly stood up, dusting himself off. He looked around at the crowd and gave a small nod of thanks, his eyes meeting those of the people who had stood up for him. The media had arrived, cameras rolling, reporters jostling for position. Peterson turned to Mason, his face grim. "You've just dug yourself a very deep hole, John." Mason's face burned with shame and fury. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the weight of his own actions was starting to settle in. He could see the headlines forming, the public outrage building. He had wanted so badly to be right, to prove himself, but now he realized how terribly wrong he'd been. Despite everything, Sam remained remarkably calm. He knew the cameras were on him, the whole city watching. He could have lashed out, demanded retribution, but he chose a different path. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his experience. "I'm just a man trying to help out some folks who need it. There's no need for all this." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Peterson nodded. "I'm sorry for what happened here today, Mr. Harris. We'll make sure this gets addressed properly." Sam nodded in acknowledgement, but his expression was solemn. "I appreciate that, Sergeant, but we need to start having some serious conversations about how things like this happen in the first place." Mason felt the world closing in around him. The crowd, the cameras, the shame. It was all too much. He turned and pushed his way back to his patrol car, slamming the door shut. Jenkins got in beside him, silent, knowing better than to say anything. As they drove away, the noise of the crowd began to fade, but Mason knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Back at the precinct, the fallout from the incident hit fast and hard. The video footage went viral, making headlines across the city and beyond. Calls flooded into the department, demanding accountability and reform. Mason was immediately placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. But the damage was already done. His colleagues avoided him, not wanting to be associated with his reckless behavior. Even those who had previously sympathized with his views were now keeping their distance. The station, usually a place of camaraderie, felt cold and hostile. Mason found himself alone, his reputation in tatters, and for the first time, he began to question his own judgment. Had he let his biases and need to be right cloud his ability to see the truth? The media attention only intensified with reporters camped outside the precinct, eager for a statement. Inside, the department was on high alert, scrambling to handle the PR nightmare Mason had created. While Mason grappled with the consequences of his actions, Sam, too, was preparing for what lay ahead. He knew this incident was not just an isolated act of discrimination. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. He decided to use this moment to shine a light on the issues of systemic racism and the need for meaningful change within law enforcement. He reached out to local civil rights groups, veteran organizations, and community leaders, organizing a public forum to address these issues head-on. He knew that his reputation and platform could help bring people together, even those who might not see eye to eye. Mason, meanwhile, was left to face the reality of his actions. He had a choice: to dig in deeper, to double down on his prejudices, or to confront his own demons and begin the hard work of change. As the days passed and the tension in the city grew, it became clear that the story of John Mason and Sam Harris was far from over. The real test was still to come. The aftermath of the botched arrest sent shockwaves through the city. The video of Officer John Mason, gun drawn, shouting down a decorated war hero, had gone viral. The outrage was immediate and fierce. Local news stations ran the footage on a loop, and talk shows dissected every second, every angle. The narrative was clear. A decorated black veteran was harassed and detained by a racist cop for simply doing his job. The police department quickly went into damage control. Press conferences were held. Carefully worded statements were released, and apologies were offered, but it wasn't enough. The community demanded more than apologies. They wanted accountability. The precinct was besieged by protesters, holding signs demanding justice for Sam Harris and condemning police prejudice. No more racist cops, justice for Sam Harris, and police harassment. The chants echoed off the brick walls of the station, growing louder each day. Inside the precinct, John Mason found himself isolated. His colleagues, once indifferent to his behavior, or even subtly supportive, now avoided him like a pariah. The air was thick with tension every time he entered the room. He was on administrative leave, but he still had to show up for the internal investigation, facing a series of uncomfortable meetings with department heads, union reps, and worse, his own conscience. Sergeant Peterson had pulled him aside after the incident. "John," he began, his face a mixture of frustration and pity. "What the hell were you thinking?" Mason's anger and defensiveness flared up. "I was doing my job, Sarge. That guy, Harris, he looked suspicious. How was I supposed to know he was some big-shot general?" Peterson shook his head. "You weren't supposed to know, but you were supposed to think. You let your damn prejudices cloud your judgment. Now the whole department's under fire, and we've got a PR nightmare on our hands." Mason felt the walls closing in. He had always prided himself on his instincts, his gut feeling that had helped him solve cases before. But now, it seemed, his gut had led him into deep trouble, and he wasn't sure how to get out. Meanwhile, Sam Harris was becoming something of a local hero. His calm demeanor and dignified response to the incident had won over the hearts of many. More than just a decorated general, he was now a symbol, a beacon of resistance against systemic racism in law enforcement. Sam didn't seek out the spotlight, but it found him. Community leaders, civil rights groups, and local activists rallied around him. They began organizing town hall meetings, forums, and public discussions to address the broader issues that his wrongful arrest had highlighted. Sam knew he had a responsibility now, a duty to use his platform to push for meaningful change. During one of these forums, held at a local community center, Sam took the stage to speak. The room was packed with people from all walks of life. Young, old, black, white, veterans, students. The energy was palpable. He could see the hope, the frustration, and the desire for change etched on their faces. "Good evening, everyone," Sam began, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm here today, not just because of what happened to me, but because of what has been happening in our communities for far too long. What we saw last week wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that we can't ignore any longer." The crowd erupted in applause. Sam continued, "We have brave men and women in law enforcement who serve with honor and integrity, but there are also those who let fear and hatred guide their actions. This isn't about one bad cop. This is about a system that needs to change, and it's up to all of us to make that change happen." Among the crowd was the elderly veteran who had stood up for Sam during the arrest. His name was Frank Mitchell, a man who had seen his share of battles and who carried the scars, both visible and invisible. Frank had served under Sam during one of the most dangerous military campaigns overseas. He knew what kind of man Sam was, and he wasn't going to let this injustice slide. As the forum continued, Frank raised his hand to speak. The room quieted as he stood up, leaning heavily on his cane. "I don't talk much these days," Frank began, his voice gravelly with age but still strong. "But I need to say this. I served under General Harris. I saw him put his life on the line for his men, for people who didn't look like him, didn't believe what he believed, but who stood beside him as brothers. If there's one thing I know, it's that you don't judge a man by the color of his skin or the uniform he wears. You judge him by his actions." The crowd applauded, and many stood in solidarity. Frank's words resonated deeply, highlighting the stark contrast between Sam's integrity and Mason's bigotry. Back in his small apartment, Mason sat in front of his television, watching the news coverage of the town hall. His name was on everyone's lips, but not in the way he had always imagined. He wasn't being praised as a dedicated officer. He was being condemned as a symbol of everything wrong with the police. For the first time in a long while, doubt crept into his mind. His anger, his bitterness, they had led him here, to this point where the world seemed to be closing in on him. He remembered his father, a staunch believer in law and order, and the lessons drilled into him from a young age. But now, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong all along. He thought about the arrest, about the look in Sam's eyes, not fear, but disappointment. Like a teacher watching a student fail a test they'd studied for. It gnawed at him. Could he have been so blinded by his own biases that he'd overlooked the truth? The phone on his coffee table buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Jenkins. "John, we need to talk," Jenkins said, his voice strained. "Look, I'm not here to lecture you, but things are getting out of hand. People are angry, and they're not just going to forget this. You need to start thinking about how you're going to make this right." Mason was silent for a long moment. "I don't know how, Mike," he finally admitted. "I don't even know where to start." "Maybe start by listening," Jenkins suggested. "And not just to me, to them. To people like Harris." The next day, after hours of agonizing over his choices, Mason decided to do something he never thought he'd do. He reached out to Sam Harris. The community had organized another town hall meeting, and Mason, swallowing his pride, sent a message through a mutual contact requesting a private conversation. To his surprise, Sam agreed. They met at a small diner on the edge of town, away from the media frenzy and the prying eyes of the precinct. Mason arrived first, nerves jangling as he waited in a booth. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so unsure of himself. When Sam walked in, He moved with the same calm confidence that had unnerved Mason during their first encounter. But this time, Mason saw it differently, not as a challenge, but as a sign of strength. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Mason said awkwardly, as Sam sat down across from him. Sam nodded. "I figured it's better to talk than not." There was a heavy silence between them. Mason struggled to find the right words that wouldn't come across as empty or insincere. "Look, I know I messed up. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just want to understand why you're doing all this." Sam studied him for a moment, then spoke softly but firmly. "What you did back there, it wasn't just a mistake, Officer Mason. It was a reflection of something bigger, something that's been allowed to fester for too long. I'm doing this because it needs to be done, because people like you and me, we've seen things from different sides, but that doesn't mean we can't find a way to bridge that gap." Mason listened, really listened, for perhaps the first time, and as he did, he felt something begin to shift within him, a small crack in the hardened shell of his beliefs. By the end of their conversation, Mason wasn't a changed man, not yet. But he left the diner with a seed of understanding, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he needed to rethink the way he saw the world. He knew it would be a long road ahead, but for the first time, he was willing to try. Sam, too, left the meeting with a sense of cautious optimism. He didn't know if Mason would truly change, but he believed in the power of dialogue, of giving people the chance to grow, and in this moment, that was enough. As Mason drove back to his small apartment, he turned off his police radio and drove in silence, reflecting on everything that had transpired. He knew he had a lot to make up for and a long way to go, but he was ready to take the first step. The city, meanwhile, watched and waited, ready for the next chapter in this unfolding story of conflict, change, and perhaps redemption. The days following John Mason's unexpected meeting with Sam Harris were some of the longest of his life. The city seemed to be on edge, and Mason found himself at the center of a storm that only grew more intense. His actions had sparked a wave of protests and demands for accountability, not just against him, but against a system that had allowed someone like him to operate unchecked for so long. Back at the precinct, things were far from normal. Mason had been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of an internal investigation. But the atmosphere was thick with tension. His desk, once surrounded by colleagues who would banter and share stories, now felt like an island of isolation. Even his longtime partner, Jenkins, was keeping his distance, choosing his words carefully whenever they spoke. The Internal Affairs Office was bustling with activity as investigators pieced together the events of that day. They reviewed the footage, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed Mason's record, looking for patterns that might indicate deeper issues. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about the culture within the department that allowed such incidents to occur. Mason sat in the small, windowless room reserved for internal reviews, his palms sweating as he faced the panel of officers and department officials. Sergeant Peterson, who had always been tough but fair, led the questioning. "Officer Mason, we've reviewed your record and the testimonies of several witnesses. It's clear that your actions were not just a matter of poor judgment, but indicative of a more significant issue," Peterson began, his tone stern. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Mason, who had always prided himself on his ability to speak with authority, found himself at a loss for words. I thought I was doing the right thing," he finally muttered. "I thought he was up to something. I was just trying to protect the community." Peterson's eyes narrowed. "Protect the community? Or protect your version of what you think this community should look like?" The room fell silent. Mason felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. Look, I've been on the force for 15 years. I know what to look for. This guy, Harris, he was too calm, too smooth. I had a gut feeling. Your gut feeling nearly got an innocent man seriously hurt and has put this entire department under scrutiny, Peterson interrupted. And now, we're all paying the price for your biases. Mason sat back, his jaw tightening. He wanted to argue, to push back, but for the first time, he was beginning to see the truth in Peterson's words. His pride had led him down this path, and now he was facing the consequences. Outside of the precinct, Mason's life was unraveling. Neighbors who once waved and smiled now turned away or muttered under their breath. He had stopped going to his usual grocery store after a particularly tense encounter with a woman who recognized him and called him a racist thug. His world was becoming smaller and smaller. Inside his small apartment, Mason found himself trapped with his own thoughts. The silence was deafening. The only sounds were the faint hum of traffic outside and the occasional creak of the building settling. He thought about his father, who had always preached about keeping order and not letting people get out of line. Those lessons, once so clear, now seemed blurred and distorted. He began to replay the events of that day over and over in his mind. The moment he drew his gun, the look on Sam's face, the voices of the crowd. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd crossed a line he never should have. One evening, as Mason sat staring blankly at his television, his phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, considering ignoring it, but something told him to pick up. "Hello," he answered cautiously. "John Mason?" a firm, unfamiliar voice asked. "Yeah, who's this?" "This is Reverend Thomas Harris from the First Baptist Church downtown. I'm Sam Harris's cousin. I'd like to talk to you if you have a moment." Mason's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. Yeah, I guess so." "Good," Reverend Harris continued. "I've been watching everything unfold, and I think you and I need to have a conversation, face to face." Mason didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to decline, to avoid another confrontation, but another part, the part that had started to feel the weight of everything, knew he needed to face this. "All right," he said finally. "When and where?" The Reverend gave him the details, and they agreed to meet the next day at a local coffee shop, away from the noise of the protests and the media. Mason hung up, his mind racing. Why would Sam's cousin want to talk to him? What did he have to gain from this? The next afternoon, Mason walked into the small coffee shop, his nerves on edge. He spotted Reverend Harris immediately, a tall, imposing man with a calm yet authoritative presence. He wore a simple suit and had the kind of demeanor that commanded respect without asking for it. "Officer Mason," Reverend Harris greeted him as he approached. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Mason nodded and sat down across from him. "Look, I'm not sure what this is about, but I'm here." The Reverend smiled slightly. "I appreciate that. I'm here because I believe there's more to this story than what we've seen on the news. I've talked to Sam, and he thinks there might be some hope for you yet." Mason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Hope? For me?" "Yes," Reverend Harris said, his eyes piercing through Mason's defenses. "Hope that you might start to see things differently. Hope that you might recognize the damage your actions have caused. Not just to Sam, but to this whole community." Mason felt a surge of defensiveness rising within him, but he held it back. "I'm not a bad person, Reverend. I was just doing what I thought was right." Reverend Harris nodded slowly. "I don't doubt that you thought you were doing the right thing. But sometimes, what we think is right is shaped by things we don't even realize, by fears, by biases, by things we've been taught. I'm not here to judge you, John. I'm here to offer you a chance to learn." There was a long pause as Mason considered the Reverend's words. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, without accusation, without anger, but with a firm kind of understanding that was even harder to face. "What do you want me to do?" Mason asked finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "I want you to listen," Reverend Harris replied, "to truly listen. Not just to me or to Sam, but to the people who have been affected by men like you, to the families who have suffered because of mistrust and fear. And I want you to think about what kind of man you want to be moving forward." The conversation with Reverend Harris left Mason with a heavy heart. For days, he grappled with the idea of attending one of the public forums being held in the community, events where police officers were invited to listen to the concerns of the citizens they served. The idea terrified him. What if he was confronted? What if he was humiliated again? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe that was the point. Maybe he needed to be uncomfortable. Maybe he needed to hear things that would force him to confront his own deeply ingrained prejudices. Finally, he made up his mind. He would go. The evening of the forum, Mason walked into the community center with his head down, trying to remain inconspicuous. The room was packed with people who had seen the video, who knew his face. He felt the weight of their eyes on him as he found a seat in the back, his heart pounding. On stage, a panel of speakers, including Sam Harris, sat waiting to begin. The room buzzed with quiet conversation, a mixture of anticipation and tension. When the event started, various community members shared their experiences with law enforcement, stories of harassment, of fear, of distrust. Each story cut through Mason like a knife, each one a reminder of the harm that could be done by a single bad decision, by a single bad officer. Then it was Sam's turn. He stood up and spoke with the same calm, measured tone that had both frustrated and impressed Mason. "We're not here to vilify every police officer," Sam began, "but we are here to demand accountability, to demand that the system changes so that men like me don't have to fear those who are supposed to protect us. This isn't about one man's mistake. It's about making sure that mistake doesn't happen again." As Sam finished speaking, he looked out into the crowd, and his eyes landed on Mason. For a moment, Mason thought he saw a flicker of recognition. The room was silent, waiting. Then, in a move that surprised everyone, Sam spoke directly to Mason. "Officer Mason, I see you out there, and I want you to know that it takes courage to come here tonight. But that's just the first step. The real work begins now." Mason felt his throat tighten, his face flush. He hadn't expected this, but instead of feeling angry or defensive, he felt relief. Relief that he was finally beginning to face the consequences of his actions. Relief that there might be a way forward. He stood up, his legs shaking, and took a deep breath. "I'm not sure what to say," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "But I want to listen. I want to learn, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did and for the pain I caused." The room was silent for a moment. Then slowly, a ripple of applause spread through the crowd. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there, a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a path to redemption. Mason knew this was just the beginning. He had a long road ahead of him, one filled with difficult conversations, uncomfortable truths, and the need to fundamentally rethink who he was and what he stood for. But he was ready to try. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose, a desire to be better, to do better. As the forum continued, he sat back down, feeling the weight of his past actions, but also the potential for something new. The journey wouldn't be easy, but it was one he was willing to take, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The city was buzzing with a cautious optimism. In the weeks following the town hall meeting, the atmosphere shifted from tense anger to a more constructive energy. Sam Harris's efforts to create dialogue between the community and law enforcement were slowly taking root. More people, inspired by his leadership, were coming forward to share their stories, and more officers were beginning to listen. But for John Mason, this was just the beginning of a long personal journey toward redemption. Mason left the forum that night feeling exposed, but strangely hopeful. The experience had been humbling, to say the least. He had always thought of himself as someone who was strong, who understood the world and his place in it. But now, he realized how narrow his perspective had been. His actions had hurt more than just one man. They had contributed to a deep-seated fear and mistrust that permeated the entire community. For days after the forum, he found himself reflecting on the stories he'd heard. Stories from people who felt trapped in their own neighborhoods, who feared those sworn to protect them, who had been victims of profiling and harassment. He had always seen himself as a protector of his community, but now he saw how his misguided sense of duty had caused more harm than good. He knew he needed to do more than just apologize. He needed to act. Determined to take real steps toward change, Mason decided to reach out to those who could help him understand what he had missed. His first call was to Reverend Thomas Harris. The conversation they had shared in the coffee shop weeks earlier had stayed with him, and he hoped the Reverend would be willing to guide him further. "Reverend Harris, it's John Mason," he said, when the Reverend picked up the phone. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I'd like to ask for your help. I want to learn. I want to understand better." There was a pause on the other end of the line before the Reverend spoke. "I'm glad you reached out, John. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's a necessary first step. We have a workshop at the church this weekend, aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. Why don't you join us?" Mason agreed. And on Saturday morning, he found himself walking into the church's community hall. The room was filled with a diverse group of people: residents, activists, and a few police officers who had decided to attend. Mason felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach, but he pushed it aside, determined to see this through. The workshop was intense. It began with a circle where everyone introduced themselves and shared why they were there. When it was Mason's turn, he took a deep breath. "My name is John Mason, and I'm here because I made a mistake. A big one. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I'm here to learn and to be better." There were a few skeptical glances, but also some nods of encouragement. The facilitators, experienced in navigating tough conversations, guided the group through a series of exercises designed to foster empathy and understanding. They discussed the history of policing, systemic racism, and the impact of personal biases. At one point, they broke into smaller groups for a more personal discussion. Mason found himself paired with a young black woman named Maya, a community organizer who had been very vocal about police reform. She didn't hide her disdain when they were paired together. "So, you're the infamous John Mason," she said, with a wry smile. Mason nodded, guilty as charged. Maya leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "Why are you really here? Is this some PR stunt, or do you actually care about changing?" Mason looked her in the eye, his expression earnest. "I'm here because I need to change. I've realized that I've been wrong about a lot of things, and I want to make it right. I know it won't be easy, and I know it'll take time, but I'm willing to put in the work." Maya studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "All right then, let's see if you mean it." After the workshop, Reverend Harris approached Mason. "You did well today, John. But remember, this is just the beginning." "I know," Mason replied. "I've got a lot to learn." The Reverend smiled. "How about you join us tomorrow? We're going to be cleaning up a park in the neighborhood. It's a small thing, but it's a way to start giving back. Mason agreed. And the next day, he found himself in a neighborhood he had rarely set foot in, wearing a pair of work gloves and holding a trash bag. The park was a community space that had fallen into disrepair, but today it was filled with volunteers, families, children, elderly residents. They worked side by side, picking up litter, planting flowers, and painting over graffiti. Mason worked quietly, focusing on the task at hand. He felt the eyes on him, the cautious glances from people who knew who he was. But he also felt something else, a sense of camaraderie, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could start to make amends. As he was raking leaves near the playground, he noticed a young boy struggling to plant a small tree. The boy looked up, his face scrunched in concentration. "Need some help?" Mason asked gently. The boy nodded. "Yeah, I'm trying to plant this tree, but the ground's too hard." Mason knelt down beside him, taking the small shovel. "Here, let me show you a trick I learned when I was a kid. You gotta loosen the soil around it first, like this," he demonstrated, and the boy watched carefully, then took the shovel and started to mimic his movements. "Thanks, mister," the boy said with a smile. Mason felt a small sense of warmth spread through him. It was a simple moment, but it felt significant. Maybe this was how it started, small steps, one after the other. A few days later, Mason received a call from Sam Harris himself. "John," Sam began, "I've heard you've been making an effort. That's good to hear. We're holding a public event next week to discuss new policies for police training and accountability. I'd like you to be there, not as an officer, but as a citizen. And if you're willing, I'd like you to share your story." Mason felt a jolt of anxiety. Speaking in front of a crowd, admitting his mistakes in such a public way, it was daunting, but he knew this was part of the work he needed to do. "I'll be there," he said, his voice steady. The day of the event, the community center was packed. People from all over the city had come to hear about the proposed changes and to voice their concerns. The energy in the room was electric, part hope, part skepticism, part determination. When it was Mason's turn to speak, he stood up, his heart pounding. He walked to the front of the room, feeling the weight of every eye on him. "I'm John Mason," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I was the officer who wrongfully detained Sam Harris. I let my biases get the better of me, and I hurt not just him, but this whole community. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on that. And I'm here today because I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." He took a deep breath, looking out at the crowd. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can do better, that I can help make things better. I know it won't be easy, but I'm committed to this work." There was a moment of silence, and then, slowly, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't unanimous. There were still skeptics, still those who would need more convincing, but it was a start. After the event, several community members approached Mason. Some were still wary, but others offered words of encouragement. Sam, who had been watching from the back, approached him with a nod of approval. "You did good, John," Sam said. "But remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. You'll need to keep showing up, keep listening, keep learning." Mason nodded. "I understand. I'm ready." In the days that followed, Mason continued to attend community meetings, workshops, and events. He met with activists, joined in on discussions about policy changes, and even started mentoring younger officers about the importance of empathy and understanding in their work. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his reputation, not as a hard-nosed cop, but as someone who was committed to change. The real turning point came when Mason and Sam Harris were invited to speak together at a citywide event on police reform. It was a powerful moment. Two men who had once been on opposite sides, now standing together, advocating for a better future. As they took the stage, Sam spoke first. Change is hard. It's messy. But it's necessary. And it starts with conversations like these, with people who are willing to admit when they're wrong, and who are willing to learn. When it was Mason's turn, he added, "I'm still learning. I'm still growing. But I've learned that it's never too late to change, and it's never too late to do the right thing." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in a long while, Mason felt a sense of peace. He knew he had a long way to go, but he was on the right path. As the event ended and people began to disperse, Sam turned to Mason and extended his hand. "You've come a long way, John. Keep going." Mason shook his hand firmly. "Thanks, Sam. I will." And with that, they stepped off the stage, side by side, ready to face whatever came next, together. For John Mason, this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning, a chance to build bridges, to make amends, and to become the officer and the man he was meant to be. It wouldn't be easy. The road to redemption never was. But with every step, he moved closer to a better version of himself. One that was defined not by fear or prejudice, but by understanding, empathy, and a commitment to justice for all. And that, he realized, was worth everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create more captivating stories. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think it's possible to change deeply rooted prejudices? We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to check out our other stories about the fight for justice and unexpected twists. We're sure you'll find them just as compelling.